The fluorescent lights in my lawyer's office flickered for what felt like the 100th time that morning. My hands were clamped around a latte from the Dunkin' drive-thru across the street, the cup sweating onto my fingers. My phone buzzed again, another text from Vanessa, my sister, telling me to just come and talk at the family intervention scheduled for 6:30 p.m. If you're watching this, subscribe and comment where you're watching from. I stared at the message, stomach twisting. Talk usually meant manipulation. I knew it, my gut screamed it, but there was a quiet hope buried somewhere that maybe, just maybe, they finally wanted to actually listen. Then the call came from Derek, my lawyer. He wouldn't be available tonight. Great. Perfect timing. By the time I pulled up to Margaret's house on Bayshore Boulevard, the golden Florida sunset was dripping across the manicured lawns like honey. The moment I stepped in, the smell of fresh cinnamon rolls hit me, a weaponized comfort meant to disarm me before the real conversation began. Vanessa greeted me with that rehearsed smile, the one that tried too hard. "Ethan, we're worried about you," she said. And I knew every word was calculated. Every hesitation in her voice, every glimmer in her eye. They weren't worried, they were after control. I nodded, and that's when I realized this wasn't just an intervention, it was a trap. A trap to convince me to sign over my savings to fund some personal project of Vanessa's. My pulse quickened. I could feel it in my chest. The ethical dilemma, confront them now and risk a fight, or play along and gather proof. I slipped my phone into my pocket, discreetly starting the recorder app. Every smile, every fake tear, every word would be evidence later. I'd keep it calm. Keep it legal. Keep it undeniable. As they sat down in the living room, Margaret clutching a throw pillow like it was a shield, Vanessa laid out the plan. They painted it with all the colors of concern and love, each sentence a subtle push toward my accounts. I felt a flash of anger, but also a strange clarity. They thought they were in control, but in truth, I'd already started the game on my terms. And if that sounds harsh, here's how we got there. I left Margaret's house that night with my recorder tucked in my pocket and my mind spinning. The AC in my car hummed softly, a mundane soundtrack to a situation that felt anything but ordinary. The glow of streetlights bounced off the dashboard as I drove down Gandy Boulevard, coffee steam curling from my venti cup, and I kept replaying every word Vanessa had said. "We're just trying to help you, Ethan." Yeah, help me give her my hard-earned money. I had always believed that keeping the peace was safer than setting boundaries. It was the lesson my parents had drilled into me growing up in Tampa. Don't rock the boat, don't make waves, and the water stays calm. But there's a difference between calm and complicit, and I was staring at that difference in broad daylight. My stomach churned at the thought that, in my desire to avoid conflict, I'd let them manipulate me before. I thought about the small details of everyday life, the fluorescent buzz of my office in downtown Tampa, the predictable chaos of the grocery store on Dale Mabry Highway, the way the line at the Starbucks drive-thru moved slower than molasses during rush hour. These little routines had always comforted me, but now they felt like a cage. I'd spent decades planning my finances, my future, my life, with spreadsheets, calendars, and meticulous notes, only to realize that the people I trusted most could try to rewrite that history in a single afternoon. My phone buzzed again, this time a notification from my bank app reminding me of the monthly transfers I'd set up, retirement accounts, savings, emergency funds. I stared at the numbers, $120, 000 here, $45, 000 there, and felt a strange mixture of pride and fear. It was my life in digits, my work in cold, precise numbers. And Vanessa wanted a piece of it. I glanced in the rearview mirror at my reflection. Tired eyes, slightly unshaven, lines forming from too many late nights reviewing client accounts and too many early mornings keeping my clients' financial futures in order. I realized how much of myself I'd poured into protecting others, while neglecting my own boundaries. My misbelief, that keeping peace at all costs was the safest path, was crumbling right there in the glow of the dashboard lights. I thought about the ethical path I could take, secretly record the meeting, gather evidence, and defend myself without stooping to their level of manipulation. It felt almost poetic, using clarity and the law, rather than deception or rage, to assert control. I pictured the legal documents, the small claims forms, the emails I'd compile, and I felt a sense of agency I hadn't felt in years. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent so long avoiding confrontation that when it finally arrived, I had to play the long game. Every grocery receipt, every email, Every casual comment from family gatherings became part of a mosaic I would one day show to prove truth over performance. The stakes weren't just money. They were the principle of respecting boundaries, the reality of accountability, and the lesson that trust must be earned, not assumed. By the time I pulled into my driveway in Hyde Park, the night air was thick with humidity, the scent of jasmine and freshly cut grass drifting through the neighborhood. I sat in my car, breathing, letting the tension drain slowly from my shoulders. I knew one thing: the confrontation tonight was only the beginning. Vanessa thought she had the upper hand. But the truth didn't start that night. It started months earlier. It all started the previous spring, when I'd returned from a week-long business trip in Orlando. I manage portfolios for high-net clients in Tampa, and it's a schedule that leaves little room for family drama, until it doesn't. Vanessa had called me at the airport, voice tight with feigned concern. She told me she was worried about my spending habits. I laughed it off, thinking she was exaggerating, but that was the first red flag. A few weeks later, I stopped by the local Publix on West Kennedy Boulevard to grab groceries. While comparing prices on avocados and almond milk, I noticed a small envelope tucked under the store's bulletin board, a receipt from a financial seminar Vanessa had signed me up for. It was billed to my credit card, without my knowledge. That tiny slip of paper felt like a breadcrumb, a subtle intrusion into my life that went unnoticed until that moment. I tucked it into my wallet, not realizing it would later serve as an early clue to her broader plan. Then there were the family gatherings. Every Sunday at Margaret's house, she and Vanessa would parade around my cousins, subtly implying that I was irresponsible or negligent. One afternoon, Vanessa brought up a supposed family trust, and hinted that it might be in danger unless I cooperated. I had no idea what she meant at the time. I smiled politely, poured myself a cup of coffee from the Keurig on the counter, and tried to ignore the growing pit in my stomach. Meanwhile, my professional life was a constant balancing act. Clients expected precision. Every number, every investment strategy had to be airtight. The mortgage on my Hyde Park home, my son's private school tuition, health insurance premiums, all of it required careful orchestration. I kept ledgers, spreadsheets, and email threads meticulously organized. Little did I know, Vanessa was quietly mapping out a plan to redirect some of my liquid assets for her own ambitions. One Friday morning, while reviewing my accounts at my office near downtown Tampa, I noticed an unusual transaction, a small, unauthorized withdrawal linked to a class Vanessa had signed me up for. It wasn't much, just a few $100s, but it was enough to ignite suspicion. I printed the email confirmation and filed it away in a folder labeled Family Discrepancies. That folder would later become a linchpin in my case, along with the Publix receipt and a photo I'd snapped of Vanessa at a family event, seemingly boasting about her influence over Margaret. Another moment that crystallized everything happened at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers game in Raymond James Stadium. Vanessa had arranged seats right behind me, whispering to Margaret about how Ethan just doesn't understand financial priorities. I could hear her, and I took mental notes, her tone, her body language, the way she tried to manipulate perception in front of others. It struck me that her ambitions weren't just casual meddling, they were deliberate, calculated, and escalating. Even our neighbors noticed the tension. At the Hyde Park Cafe, where I grab coffee on Saturday mornings, the barista asked, half-joking, if Vanessa and I were still playing those little mind games. I laughed it off, but inside, a new sense of urgency was forming. My misbelief, that avoiding conflict would keep my life intact, was starting to unravel. I realized that inaction had allowed her to gather momentum, to manipulate situations where I wasn't present, and to slowly erode the boundaries I thought were untouchable. By late May, I began connecting dots. The receipt at Publix, the unauthorized seminar charges, the whispered comments at games, the pressure at family dinners, all signs pointed toward a bigger plan. Vanessa wasn't just meddling. She was orchestrating a fake intervention to gain access to my accounts. And Margaret? She was the perfect accomplice, loyal, impressionable, and emotionally entangled with her daughter's concern. Which brings us to the plan I should have made sooner. I knew confrontation was inevitable, but I also knew that to protect myself, I had to gather every possible piece of evidence legally and ethically. Every receipt, every email, every recorded conversation would become a shield. I started organizing my strategy, research the legal mechanisms, note deadlines, and mentally map out the boundaries I'd never let her cross. By the time summer rolled in, I had assembled a quiet arsenal. A folder for receipts, a folder for emails, and a small digital recorder in my pocket at every meeting. Every seemingly mundane detail, like the public's receipt or the financial seminar email, was now a clue, a small but vital part of the puzzle that would eventually expose the full extent of Vanessa's scheme. I spent the week before the intervention meticulously planning my approach. Tampa was in full summer bloom, humid, with late afternoon thunderstorms rolling in from the Gulf, but inside my Hyde Park condo, it was all spreadsheets, phone calls, and sticky notes. My primary objective was clear: protect my assets, gather undeniable evidence, and do it entirely within the law. I had spoken to Derek Lane, my trusted lawyer, earlier that week. He had a full caseload and couldn't be present for the intervention, but he'd laid out a simple, lawful framework. Step 1. Discreetly record any conversation where Vanessa and Margaret tried to pressure me. Step 2. Compile receipts, emails, and relevant documents into a single chronological digital dossier. Step 3. Confirm that every action I took was legally sound, from the recording to any potential small claims filings or formal notices. I also made a note to double-check Florida's consent laws for recordings. Thankfully, Florida is a two-party consent state, but I was in the room, a direct participant. Everything I captured would be admissible, provided I didn't cross boundaries. I even labeled the recorder notes, just to keep it inconspicuous. To make things more concrete, I drafted a simple ledger. It included the seminar charge Vanessa snuck onto my card, $275, the minor transfer she suggested during previous gatherings, and the public's receipt. Each line had a timestamp, a source, and a note about why it mattered. It may have looked obsessive to someone else, but to me, it was clarity amid chaos. I also identified my allies. Derek was unavailable in person, but he was reachable by email and phone for urgent consultation. And then there was Jordan Whitman, my longtime colleague at the firm. Jordan had no stake in my family drama, but understood how to navigate tricky interpersonal situations. He offered perspective on how to present facts calmly, without letting emotions compromise legal safety. The timer was pressing. The intervention was scheduled for the Friday evening before the 4th of July weekend, a notoriously busy week. Vanessa had deliberately picked a time when she assumed I'd be distracted: client meetings, grocery runs, and getting my teenage son ready for the holiday parade. I knew any hesitation could be interpreted as compliance. That was the leverage she was counting on. I drove by Margaret's house in the late afternoon, running through my mental checklist. Phone charged, recorder in pocket, ledger printed and tucked into my satchel. I even practiced a few boundary phrases out loud. I need to review this with my advisor. I'm not comfortable making financial decisions under pressure. Let's stick to facts, not assumptions. When I stepped inside the house, everything seemed staged. The air smelled of vanilla candles and the faint tang of lemon furniture polish. Vanessa had spread herself across the living room like a conductor orchestrating concern. Margaret clutched a throw pillow, eyes glossy, ready to support her daughter's narrative. My stomach tightened, but I took a slow, steadying breath. The meeting began, and Vanessa immediately launched into rehearsed lines about my financial instability, my lack of foresight, and how the family needed to protect me. It was infuriating, but I held my composure, letting her words be captured by the recorder. Every push, every manipulation, was now evidence, ironically, the tool of justice hidden in plain sight. I glanced at Margaret, seeing the subtle cues Vanessa had trained her to perform. That's when I realized, they were so confident, so certain of my compliance, that they didn't notice I had already flipped the power dynamic. Their sense of control was a mirage. My plan wasn't just to survive the intervention, it was to turn the meeting into a legal advantage. Then the pushback started. Vanessa noticed my calm, my subtle smirks when she overreached, and she tried doubling down. That's fine. I was ready. Every overreach was another line I could document, another entry in my ledger. By the end of this evening, I knew I'd have enough to make them accountable, and I wouldn't need to raise my voice once. By the time they thought the intervention was ending, I had the evidence, the plan, and the legal framework to move forward. Vanessa and Margaret believed they were winning, but I had quietly laid the foundation for a lawful, irrefutable reversal. The days after the intervention were tense. I stayed home more than usual, reviewing the recordings and organizing my ledger. Everything was clear, neat, and legally defensible, but complications began piling up like storm clouds over Tampa Bay. First, Derek Lane, my lawyer, hit a scheduling snag. He was tied up in a multi-day hearing with another client and couldn't provide real-time advice as I had hoped. That left me relying on my own judgment for any immediate moves. I felt the pressure, not just from Vanessa and Margaret, but from my own responsibility to act precisely and legally. Every misstep could invalidate the careful evidence I had gathered. Then came the unexpected, a lien notice on my Hyde Park condo. Apparently, a minor contractor I'd used for a landscaping job had filed incorrectly, claiming a past due amount. It was only $650, but it complicated my financial picture. Vanessa immediately seized on the news in casual conversation, subtly implying that my mismanagement had consequences. Even from a distance, she was trying to turn external factors into leverage. I had to pause, take a deep breath, and remind myself that this was a distraction. The evidence I already had was still solid, and the lien was something I could quickly resolve. On top of that, Margaret called almost daily, guilt-tripping me with faint cries about how worried she was for my future and Vanessa's concern. I answered politely but kept conversations short, always redirecting to logistics or facts. Each interaction reminded me of the importance of staying detached. Emotional manipulation was part of their strategy, and I couldn't give them an opening. A mini reveal emerged midweek. While cross-referencing receipts and seminar emails, I stumbled upon a forwarded message Vanessa had accidentally sent to Margaret instead of me. In it, she bragged about her plan to use my accounts to fund a side business, an investment she insisted would benefit the family. This tiny slip confirmed my suspicion. The intervention was never about concern, it was about control and personal gain. I added it to my digital folder, marking it as Exhibit B. Socially, complications mounted too. At the Hyde Park Cafe, neighbors who had once been neutral started whispering about the family drama unfolding. Rumors spread quickly in a community where everyone knew everyone else. I maintained my composure, speaking in measured tones, careful not to let gossip slip into evidence or interfere with my ethical plan. Even Jordan Whitman, my ally, reminded me of the risk. They'll push harder if they sense you're preparing a formal response. Just be ready for countermoves. And sure enough, Vanessa tried to schedule a second concern meeting, this time dragging in a local financial advisor who she believed would intimidate me. I politely declined, citing my prior commitments, and made notes of the attempted manipulation. Every pushback became another entry in my ledger. By midweek, it became clear that I was facing a layered strategy. Vanessa was using emotional, social, and even external financial pressures to test my boundaries. Each complication forced me to balance two priorities: staying calm and following the law, and ensuring my evidence chain remained unbroken. I couldn't retaliate with confrontation. I had to document, preserve, and plan the legal response. That's when I realized I'd been looking at the wrong problem. The issue wasn't just Vanessa trying to take control. It was the family's belief that my silence and politeness meant consent. They misread courtesy as weakness. And once I reframed the goal, the path forward became clear: maintain composure, gather every piece of evidence, and leverage lawful mechanisms to establish boundaries they couldn't ignore. By the following Monday, the pattern was obvious. Vanessa wasn't just persistent, she was methodical. Every call, every text, every casual suggestion at family gatherings had a purpose: to erode my confidence and pressure me into signing over financial control. I realized I needed a new lens, a pivot. It wasn't enough to defend myself passively. I had to actively reframe the situation on my own terms. I took a deep breath one humid Tampa morning, the AC hum of my condo fighting the heavy air outside. Coffee in hand, I mapped out a public stance I could maintain ethically. No shouting, no accusations, just facts and clear boundaries. I drafted a simple statement in my ledger, something I could say at any future meeting: I appreciate your concern, but I am not making financial decisions under pressure, and I will only discuss these matters with my legal advisor present. I decided to put the plan into action at the next family event, a small Sunday brunch at Margaret's. It was the perfect public moment. Vanessa thought she controlled the narrative because she had Margaret's support, the carefully prepared cinnamon rolls, and the backdrop of a social setting that implied casual oversight. But I had my own weapons: calm demeanor, recorded evidence in my pocket, and a rehearsed script that asserted boundaries without giving her leverage. At brunch, Vanessa started her usual routine: gentle concern, pointed questions, and sly comments about my financial responsibility. I listened, nodded politely, and let her talk. Then calmly, I interjected: I've reviewed all of my accounts and documents. Any decisions regarding money will be discussed with my advisor before any action is taken." My voice was steady, unflappable. Margaret looked startled, like she hadn't been prepared for this level of calm assertion. The shift was palpable. Vanessa's confident posture faltered just slightly. Her eyes narrowed, and I could see her calculating her next move in real time. But I held the room with quiet authority. I didn't need to yell, argue, or retaliate. My words, backed by the looming evidence in my pocket and my ledger on the table, carried weight. Then came the boundary declaration that truly shifted the dynamics. "Vanessa, I understand your concerns, but any further attempts to influence my finances without my consent will be documented and handled legally. I've already started keeping careful records." For the first time, I sensed that she recognized the rules had changed. The intervention was no longer a game she could manipulate. It had become an ethical standoff. Every smile, every tear, every argument she tried to deploy was now being met with calm, documented resistance. So I stopped asking for permission and started following the rules, every single one. No informal agreements, no whispered pressures, no emotional manipulation could override my preparation. Every meeting, every phone call, every visit to Margaret's house was an opportunity to reinforce boundaries while quietly collecting evidence. By the end of the brunch, Vanessa made one final push, a seemingly innocuous question about a minor joint expense I'd previously agreed to, but I had anticipated it. I responded with my pre-planned phrase, "I will review this with my advisor before any decisions are made." It was polite, factual, and left her no room to argue. The shift was complete, the power dynamic had flipped, and I was now in control ethically, legally, and emotionally. And in that moment, I realized something crucial. This wasn't just about money or manipulation. It was about asserting my right to define my life and my boundaries, about demonstrating that calm, law-abiding persistence could outmaneuver manipulation. The intervention had failed, not because I had fought harder, but because I had prepared smarter. After the brunch, I treated the situation like a professional project. I had my roadmap: gather evidence, preserve legality, and prepare for the moment when I could assert my boundaries decisively. Every step had to be methodical, factual, and traceable. First, I organized the recordings from the intervention. Each snippet was labeled by time, date, and content. Vanessa's repeated insistence that I trust the family, while suggesting access to my accounts, became Exhibit A. The minor forward email about her side investment became Exhibit B. And the public's receipt and unauthorized seminar charge were Exhibit C. Together, they formed a chronological narrative that showed intent, manipulation, and unethical pressure. Next, I consulted Derek by email, outlining every detail. He confirmed that the recordings were admissible under Florida law since I was a participant. He also suggested a certified mail demand, a letter stating that any attempts to pressure me financially would result in legal action. I drafted it carefully, emphasizing calm, factual language and avoiding emotional accusations. Then came small claims preparation. I filled out forms for potential claims to recover minor unauthorized charges and document Vanessa's attempts at financial coercion. Each claim included exact amounts, dates, and proof from the ledger. The goal wasn't punishment. It was accountability and a clear boundary enforcement. I also leveraged Jordan Whitman's advice. He suggested gathering witness statements for minor social interactions, family friends who had observed Vanessa's manipulation. 2 neighbors recalled overhearing her pushing for account access during family events. Their statements added weight to my ethical and factual narrative, reinforcing the documented evidence. Each morning, I reviewed the plan while sipping coffee at my favorite Hyde Park cafe. I double-checked deadlines, cross-referenced receipts, and updated the digital folder with annotations. Every move was deliberate, no surprises, no rash decisions, no loopholes Vanessa could exploit. The spreadsheet became my battlefield map, each documented interaction a checkpoint toward a lawful resolution. Even mundane errands became strategic. When Vanessa called to check in, I calmly noted her words in the ledger, marking any suggestion of pressure. Each phone call became another entry, another layer of evidence. My approach was consistent, polite, factual, and always legal. By midweek, I sent the certified mail demand to Vanessa and Margaret. It stated clearly that any further attempts to influence my finances without legal authorization would lead to formal action. The letters were sent with return receipt requested, creating a verifiable chain. I felt a surge of control. This was my lawful line in the sand. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Vanessa reacted, of course, trying subtle manipulations through casual texts, social media comments, and hints at family gatherings. But each time, I responded with factual statements or silence, documenting everything. My calm persistence and meticulous records ensured that every pushback only strengthened my case. By the end of the week, I had transformed anxiety into agency. The plan was fully executed: recordings, receipts, witness statements, certified letters, and small claims forms, all organized, defensible, and ready to be deployed if necessary. I had not lashed out, threatened, or acted impulsively. I had used patience, preparation, and legality to turn the tables completely in my favor. For a moment, it felt like I'd won. Vanessa and Margaret hadn't responded to the certified letters immediately. The ledger and recordings were organized, and I felt a quiet confidence that the legal framework I'd built was airtight. I imagined walking into small claims court or presenting the evidence to Derek and having the situation resolved swiftly. I let myself exhale for the first time in weeks. Then the backfire hit. It started with a casual text from Margaret. "Ethan, Vanessa feels hurt. Can we talk?" At first, I ignored it, knowing it was a bait to test boundaries. But soon, subtle pressure started to seep into my social circles. A few neighbors, who'd overheard snippets of family drama, began offering unsolicited opinions. One even suggested that I was being overly harsh with my own family. It was subtle, but it stung. My social credibility, the one thing I hadn't anticipated, was suddenly under quiet assault. Vanessa, sensing a delay in my response, tried another angle. She contacted Jordan, my ally, ostensibly to mediate family tensions. Jordan called me immediately, concerned. "Ethan, she's spinning this. She's trying to frame you as overreacting," he said. My meticulous documentation was solid, but this was a reminder: even with the best preparation, public perception could complicate outcomes. I also discovered a minor financial snafu. The landscaping lien I thought I'd resolved had an error in the filing date, meaning it technically still showed as pending. Vanessa immediately capitalized on this in a casual brunch conversation, smiling as she said, "Well, maybe some financial mismanagement isn't just about minor charges." I felt the heat rise. The situation was morphing. My ethical strategy was intact, but external factors, misperceptions, minor paperwork errors, social murmurs, threatened to undermine it. The emotional low point came when Margaret, tearful and persistent, tried to guilt me in person. She implied that my rigid adherence to rules and forms was hurting family unity, and I could see Vanessa nodding subtly in agreement. For a moment, I questioned whether the careful, lawful path I'd laid out was worth the personal cost. The pushback was relentless, and for the first time, I wondered if patience and legality alone would be enough. Until one line in an old message changed everything. While double-checking the forwarded email from Vanessa about her side investment, I noticed an overlooked clause. She had asked Margaret to record any compliance from Ethan for later reference. In other words, Vanessa had been planning to frame me as the aggressive or unreasonable party if I resisted. That single sentence reframed everything. It wasn't just manipulation, it was premeditated evidence gathering to cast me in a negative light. Suddenly, the minor backfires, neighbor whispers, small errors, social perception, were no longer random setbacks. They were part of Vanessa's strategy. And the realization brought clarity. If I responded strategically, leveraging every recording, email, and ledger entry, I could counteract not just her financial pressure, but her attempt to rewrite the narrative entirely. The apparent victory had been an illusion. My ethical and lawful plan was still intact, but it needed recalibration. I couldn't simply rely on my documents alone. I had to anticipate Vanessa's attempts to manipulate perception and ensure that every action I took reinforced the undeniable factual record. It was a rainy Wednesday evening when everything finally clicked into place. I had gone through the recordings yet again, headphones snug over my ears, a mug of lukewarm coffee sweating condensation onto my ledger. Vanessa's voice, smooth and persuasive, echoed in my mind, but this time I was listening for intention, not just content. That's when I noticed the pattern I had previously overlooked. Her references to helping me see reason weren't about financial advice at all. They were about controlling perception, framing me as unstable or irresponsible so that any resistance could be dismissed as irrational. Margaret's role also became clearer. She wasn't just a passive accomplice. She was the one Vanessa trusted to reinforce the illusion of concern. Margaret had genuinely believed her daughter was protecting the family, but the minor details I'd collected, the receipts, the seminar charges, the subtle notes about financial discussions, showed a disturbing alignment. Every small act, every whispered suggestion at a Sunday brunch, had been orchestrated to pressure me without appearing coercive. I leaned back in my chair and studied the 3 key documents I had planted months earlier, almost casually: the public's receipt for the seminar charge, the forwarded email about the side investment, and a photo taken at a family gathering where Vanessa subtly displayed her influence over Margaret. It was a trifecta of proof, and each item connected in a way that made the entire operation undeniable. The revelation hit hardest when I realized the true motive wasn't just money or control, it was ego. Vanessa wanted to prove to herself, to Margaret, and to anyone watching that she could manipulate a grown man into submission without appearing to do so. That need to assert dominance had disguised itself as concern. Seeing it so clearly shifted my perspective from anger to strategic resolve. I didn't have to fight emotion with emotion. I only needed to present the facts and let the evidence speak. I gathered everything: ledger, recordings, emails, and created a master folder labeled with a date and timestamp. Every interaction I had documented now had context, and the timeline revealed the full extent of the scheme. Looking through it, I realized that Vanessa's earlier confidence at the intervention had been her greatest mistake. She had assumed I would react emotionally, that I would try to confront her verbally, and that I might overlook small details. Instead, her own planning had provided a map straight to the truth. By then, I also understood how to present this legally and ethically. Derek had reminded me earlier that evidence was only as strong as its narrative. It wasn't enough to have receipts and recordings. I needed to weave them into a coherent, factual story. I began drafting a concise account, with each piece of evidence tied to a specific action, date, and attempt at manipulation. The picture that emerged was airtight. The intervention was a contrived event designed to pressure me into financial compliance, all documented and verifiable. At that moment, a sense of calm washed over me. The chaos of past weeks, the late-night anxiety, the careful monitoring of calls, the minor missteps and backfires, was replaced by clarity. I knew exactly where to stand, exactly what steps to take, and how to neutralize Vanessa and Margaret's manipulations. No longer reactive, I was fully in control. The major reveal wasn't about catching them in one single act. It was about connecting the dots, the receipts, the recordings, the emails, the subtle behavioral cues, and seeing the pattern emerge. Once I saw it, everything else became straightforward. My next steps wouldn't be about retaliation. They would be about enforcing boundaries, protecting my assets, and allowing the truth to speak for itself. And just like that, the path forward was clear. Vanessa's intervention wasn't just fake. It was her undoing, laid bare by the meticulous evidence I had quietly collected. The morning after the major reveal, I felt a clarity I hadn't experienced in weeks. Tampa's humidity pressed against the windows, but inside my Hyde Park condo, the air was calm, almost charged with focus. I knew exactly what needed to happen. This wasn't about emotional retribution. It was about lawful, ethical accountability, and about reclaiming my peace. I started with the certified letters. I revised them slightly, citing specific instances from the ledger, the unauthorized seminar charge, the repeated financial suggestions, and the forwarded email about the side investment. Each paragraph referenced the precise documentation I had collected, and each line emphasized legality and consequences rather than anger. The letters were concise, factual, and unemotional, yet every word carried the weight of undeniable evidence. Next, I filed small claims cases. I didn't exaggerate or inflate figures. I filed exactly what I could prove. The seminar charge of $275, the minor account transfers totaling $432, and the documentation of time spent attempting to untangle financial suggestions, all meticulously itemized with dates, receipts, and emails attached. The court clerk in Tampa's small claims office was professional, verifying each form, and I left with stamped copies confirming my filing. Every action was documented, creating a legal chain of accountability. I also leveraged the witness statements. Jordan had compiled notes from neighbors who had observed subtle manipulations at prior family events. I submitted these statements along with my filings, demonstrating that the manipulations weren't isolated incidents, but a consistent pattern. The witnesses didn't exaggerate or editorialize. They simply confirmed facts. Their testimony added weight to the legal process and strengthened my position. Then came the next stage, exposure without confrontation. I arranged a mediated meeting, scheduled through Derek, where Vanessa and Margaret could see the evidence in a controlled environment. I presented the facts calmly, letting the documentation and recordings speak. No shouting, no emotional pleas, just the truth laid bare. Vanessa's eyes widened slightly as she realized that every attempt at coercion had been catalogued and preserved, and that the law now backed my boundaries. Margaret, looking guilty but still supportive of her daughter, shifted uncomfortably. The effect was immediate. Both women understood that any further attempts to manipulate or pressure me would have direct, verifiable consequences. Vanessa tried to interject a defensive comment, but I calmly reminded her that the documents were already part of the legal record, and any attempts to dispute them would only reinforce the chain of evidence. It was the first time in weeks I felt a genuine sense of authority and safety around them. Over the next few days, the small claims court processed my filings efficiently. The seminar charge and account transfers were ruled in my favor, and Vanessa was ordered to reimburse the exact amounts, plus minor court fees. The mediator confirmed that my clear, factual documentation had left little room for dispute. I didn't gloat. I didn't feel the need to. The law had done the heavy lifting. By midweek, I implemented a final safeguard. I updated my bank accounts with dual authentication, consulted my financial advisor on minor contract clauses for shared expenses, and reinforced digital security for any future attempts at unauthorized access. Each measure was preventive, legal, and proportionate. Vanessa and Margaret were aware that boundaries had shifted permanently, and that any future overreach would have immediate consequences. Emotionally, the release was profound. I felt adrenaline and calm interweaving. First, the rush of asserting authority, then the deep settling satisfaction that everything had been done lawfully. The intervention, the manipulations, the minor setbacks and backfires, all had led to a moment where clarity, preparation, and ethical persistence paid off. I didn't need to humiliate anyone or act impulsively. The system, documentation, and rules had done the work. And then came the coals. Derek confirmed that all filings were in order, small claims notices were delivered, and there were no procedural missteps. Jordan messaged that the neighbors were relieved the situation had been resolved ethically and without drama. Even my teenage son, who had watched the tension unfold at home, gave me a quiet nod, recognizing that boundaries had been defended responsibly. Most importantly, Vanessa called me herself, her tone wary, cautious. She acknowledged that her attempts had been inappropriate and promised to respect my boundaries moving forward. I didn't respond with anger. I simply reminded her that the legal record was clear and that any deviation from compliance would have immediate consequences. The responsibility for change rested with her, but the control rested with me. In the days that followed, I noticed a remarkable shift. Family gatherings became neutral spaces, no longer dominated by manipulation or subtle coercion. I could attend events, enjoy conversations, and engage with loved ones without the underlying tension of financial overreach. The ledger, the recordings, the emails, they were no longer active tools. They were the quiet assurance that my boundaries were respected. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt free. Not free from my family, but free from the anxiety of manipulation, from the constant fear of coercion, and from the misplaced belief that politeness equaled consent. I had learned that calm preparation, lawful documentation, and unwavering adherence to rules could not only protect me but also enforce boundaries without resorting to cruelty. The law had become my shield, the ledger my sword, and my own composure the armor that carried me through weeks of tension. And as I sipped coffee at the Hyde Park Cafe one humid morning, watching rain streak the windows and kids ride bikes past the fountain, I realized I had not just defended my finances, I had reclaimed my life. The immediate aftermath was quieter than I expected. Vanessa reimbursed the seminar charge and account transfers within days, a clear acknowledgement of the boundaries I had enforced. Margaret, though still tentative, began giving subtle signals of respect for my decisions, no longer trying to mediate or sway me without invitation. The small victories felt almost mundane compared to the tension of previous weeks, but that was exactly the point. Stability, not spectacle, became my reward. Neighbors who had whispered about the family drama began treating interactions normally again. A few even complimented the calm professionalism I displayed, noting how I had handled a potentially explosive situation without escalating it. Even the minor lien error, once a source of embarrassment, was resolved, leaving my financial record spotless. The ripple effect of methodical, lawful action became tangible, my credibility remained intact, and my personal reputation emerged stronger. Emotionally, the relief was profound. The constant anxiety, the sleepless nights tracking texts and calls, and the fear of overstepping or being manipulated, all of it eased. I could finally think about long-term planning without feeling pressure from hidden agendas. I'd established that assertiveness, backed by legality and thorough documentation, was both effective and sustainable. I also noticed unexpected changes in Vanessa's behavior. She became cautious in her suggestions and refrained from discussing financial matters without my explicit consent. It wasn't a dramatic apology, it was quieter, more practical, a subtle acknowledgement that her previous approach had consequences. Margaret followed suit, reducing attempts to intervene unnecessarily. The family dynamics, once tense and fraught, gradually became more predictable and less emotionally taxing. And just when I thought it was settled, a small curious detail reminded me how fully the lesson had landed. Vanessa sent a birthday card for my son. Inside, the message was carefully neutral and thoughtful, free of any pressure or suggestion. Even in that small gesture, I could see the acknowledgement of boundaries. It was minor, yes, but it was proof that lawful ethical action could reshape behavior more effectively than confrontation ever could. The fallout then wasn't about punishment, it was about clarity, respect, and sustainable boundaries. In enforcing the rules calmly and thoroughly, I had not just protected my finances, I had reshaped the family dynamic in a way that was enduring, lawful, and morally sound. Just as the rhythm of normalcy settled in, the twist arrived, not from Vanessa, but from an unexpected source. Jordan, my steadfast ally, called one afternoon, his tone a mix of amusement and caution. "Ethan, you won't believe this," he said. Apparently, Margaret had quietly reached out to him weeks ago, attempting to influence his testimony. She'd claimed she didn't fully understand Vanessa's intentions and asked Jordan to be lenient if the court questioned her. I realized then that the wild card in our story, someone I trusted to observe neutrally, had almost been swayed before my documentation sealed the narrative. It was a minor revelation, but it reframed the entire sequence. I had assumed the evidence alone was enough to secure fairness, but human influence, especially subtle behind-the-scenes nudges, was a constant variable. Jordan had quietly refused to bend, but the fact that Margaret even tried highlighted how fragile ethical alignment can be. It wasn't enough to have documentation, I had needed vigilance, consistency, and a clear record of intentions. Then came the double twist, almost poetic in its subtlety. Vanessa sent a follow-up email, innocuous on the surface, requesting clarification about a shared expense from 2 months prior. I opened it, expecting a test of boundaries. Instead, she confessed, almost reluctantly, that she'd realized her attempts at manipulation had been unnecessary and unfair. She referenced the ledger indirectly, admitting she now understood why I had kept such meticulous records. The irony wasn't lost on me. Vanessa, who had orchestrated the fake intervention to gain control, was now using my own framework of transparency and accountability to recognize her missteps. The very tools I had assembled to defend myself had guided her to see the error of her ways. It wasn't a dramatic confession or an emotional apology, it was the quiet acknowledgement of consequence and cause and effect. In that moment, I understood the full lesson of the ordeal. What I learned wasn't about them. It was about me, about patience, preparation, and the power of lawful ethical action. I hadn't needed to manipulate or retaliate, I had needed to document, enforce, and remain consistent. The double twist was that the resolution had come not from forcing change, but from creating a space where the truth was unavoidable and self-correcting. It was a satisfying closure, both strategically and emotionally. The family dynamic remained intact, but boundaries were respected, the manipulations were exposed, but relationships weren't destroyed. And for the first time, I felt the confidence that my actions had been both effective and morally sound. Sitting on my balcony one evening, watching the sun dip below the Tampa skyline, I reflected on the journey I just navigated. The intervention, the backfires, the meticulous planning, and the eventual resolution all pointed to a single truth. My misbelief, that keeping the peace was safer than setting boundaries, had been the root of the problem. Boundaries, I realized, weren't walls to isolate or punish. They were a framework for respect, clarity, and self-preservation. The lesson was simple but profound. First, documenting interactions and maintaining factual records transformed uncertainty into agency. I could track, verify, and respond with precision rather than reacting emotionally. Second, lawful, ethical action had a power of its own. I didn't need to intimidate, yell, or manipulate. By adhering to rules and procedures, I created consequences that were proportionate, fair, and undeniable. Third, patience and consistency matter more than quick victories. Every recording, email, and ledger entry became part of a chain that ultimately reshaped behavior without resorting to cruelty. I also understood that empathy and accountability could coexist with firmness. Vanessa and Margaret weren't villains. They were human, flawed, and influenced by their own perceptions and fears. By maintaining boundaries firmly yet ethically, I allowed them the opportunity to recognize and correct their missteps without humiliation. That balance, between personal protection and humane resolution, was the true theme of the ordeal. Finally, the experience highlighted the importance of preparation and foresight. Anticipating manipulation, planning responses, and keeping meticulous records didn't just prevent loss. It created a sustainable path for ongoing interactions. I realized that life often presents pressures disguised as concern, and the most effective way to navigate them is with foresight, composure, and adherence to lawful principles. Here's the picture I want you to keep. A ledger, recordings, emails, and calm reflection weren't tools of revenge. They were tools of empowerment. By defining boundaries and following rules, I reclaimed agency over my finances, my family interactions, and ultimately, my peace of mind. I returned to the Hyde Park kitchen where it all began. The same morning light streamed through the blinds, casting thin stripes across the counter where my ledger had once lived in near-constant chaos. Now the pages were neatly stacked, digital backups filed securely, and my coffee mug sat quietly beside them, untouched. The storm of tension that had filled this space for weeks felt distant, replaced by calm and control. The house smelled faintly of baked bread from the neighbor downstairs, a reminder that life continued outside my carefully curated bubble of facts and boundaries. I ran my fingers over the ledger, thinking about the path that had led here, the recordings, the receipts, the certified letters, the careful documentation of every interaction. Each small action, each ethical step, had created a chain reaction that resolved the conflict without drama, humiliation, or illegal measures. Even Vanessa and Margaret, who had once seemed untouchable in their manipulations, were now operating within boundaries I had lawfully enforced. The lesson was tangible, almost visible, in the calm, light-filled kitchen. The moment felt like a visual echo of the opening. Same kitchen, same morning light, but a completely different me. I wasn't reactive, anxious, or second-guessing my actions. I was present, calm, and empowered. Tampa hummed outside, traffic moving in its usual rhythm, children laughing on nearby sidewalks, the familiar scent of coffee from the corner cafe drifting in through the open window. All of it underscored that life could carry on without chaos, if you had the tools and discipline to enforce boundaries. I smiled, realizing that the entire ordeal had been a masterclass in patience, preparation, and lawful action. I hadn't needed to raise my voice, manipulate, or escalate. Instead, I had relied on documentation, rules, and calm consistency, and it had worked. The family dynamic had shifted, my finances were secure, and my peace of mind was intact. The visual closure was more than just a tidy kitchen. It was a metaphor for a life reclaimed. If this hit home, subscribe and tell me your state in the comments. Your story might be next.